Hello, I'm Chris Bishop, and as we continue our budget analysis here on CNBC Africa, we brought into the studio the decision makers, the people who have to allocate resources and put their money where their mouth is in these difficult economic times. The CEOs, what do they think? We've got an esteemed group here. I'm joined by Vusi Thembekwayo, the CEO of My Growth Fund, Stephen Schultz, the CEO of Momentum Securities, and Xolile Sizani, the Group CEO of Servest, the largest black majority-owned facilities management company in Africa that employs 23,000 people. But let's have a quick look before we start the discussion into the markets, see how they're reacting to the budget speech. Well, that's what the markets thought of today's budget speech. What do the CEOs think when I go around the table? Starting with you, Steve, what was your immediate reaction?
It was a very unenviable task. I think it was a very challenging backdrop, both consumer, business and economic backdrop. If I had to give it a score out of 10 and rate it, I'd say it was a solid 8 out of 10. Market tends to agree. The Rand and some of the SA Inc. stocks up quite strongly. A few positives. I think the no tax cut comes at a massive relief to many, as well as just some of the deep hard cuts that I think we'd all been waiting for. Negatives for me was definitely the budget deficit and lack of detail, perhaps.
Well, Lily, I mean, the budget deficit and the overall budget, what's your view?
I think overall he had a tough responsibility to try and manage, especially in the context of the expected I won't say downgrading, but expected review in terms of where we stand as a country. Individuals are quite pleased that there were no tax increases. I think everyone was pleased with that. Also the fact that he's putting a lot of money to support the NPA, because in all of the challenges that we face in this country, we have to close that tap. So that was heartwarming. Also, I think there's a lot of work to be done around Eskom. I think many of our suppliers and the clients are facing the tough challenges in this economy because of the impact of Eskom. So I think overall it was a well balanced. I think also the success of how this budget will be measured in terms of the implementation. So the jury is still out to get a sense of whether there will be an ability from the leadership in government to implement these plans. I think that's where we're going to see the true measure of the success of this budget speech.
Vusi.
Yeah, I thought it was fair, balanced, but unexciting, which probably kind of gives you a sense of his position at the moment. Frankly, I think on the minister's behalf, he's just out of runway. And I think a lot of us were expecting creativity and latitude where he has none. This, for me, felt like a kind of pragmatic budget with a pragmatic perspective of where the country is. Deep cuts when necessary, without necessarily trying to hemorrhage the patient. So unexciting, but fair and balanced.
Let's have just a look at what he said about one of the big talking points of the day. He said he's going to shave off 160 billion rand from the civil service budget, something that the ratings agencies and just about everybody's been crying out for ages. But let's have a listen to see what he plans to do.
The second part is adjustments on the wage bill by about 160 billion rand over the medium term. Public servants do crucial work for our country, often unappreciated, in difficult conditions. The governing party is a firm believer in the critical role of the state in development. For this reason, we need qualified, motivated, and effective staff members.
I speak to you on that one, Xolile. I mean, what do you think? Are you encouraged? I mean, the one thing that worried me about that was just so vague. He said, in the medium term. What's that? Is that 5 years, 10 years? I don't know.
And again, I think the challenge is always understanding that government has come to power because of the support of the unions.
Yeah.
So you can never try and position yourself, especially in a platform like this, with that level of detail. That's why I said in my earlier comment that you would need to test the ability of him to implement these plans as we go along. But to suggest that the public servants are quite a huge burden on the state is a fact. However, I think the more we can improve the leadership, because these things stand and fall on leadership. Because part of the problem that we have with the quality of the services that we get from the state is partly because the leadership is challenged from that perspective, and therefore this thing cascades all the way to the colleagues. So when you see a department that has got a bloated staff, yet it's unable to deliver, and you are curtailed as a manager in restructuring and putting enough measures to optimize the structure, there's really little you can do. So it's you are not going to get those statistics as to over what period of time because of the constituency that the government has to.
But if I get to you, Vusi, on this one, I mean, we're talking about unions here, and every time it comes up, talking about either cutting back or either selling off the parastatals or whatever, people say, oh, well, the unions won't allow it. But I mean, surely that's something that has to be gone through.
Yeah. I think, by the way, this is not just the Minister of Finance. I think it's a pervasive statement that holds true for the number one citizen too, which is when the Titanic is sinking, you can't seek consensus. And the difficulty is there is this idea that you've got to take with you the other parties in the program of governance when you're in a situation where things are really dire. So I think that's the first part. The second part, which Xolile kind of touched on, is my assessment to the public sector wage bill actually is that there is more misallocation of capital and a misallocation of resources. So you find a very top-heavy government structure with people who want to sit in nice, very air-conditioned offices in Pretoria where service delivery doesn't happen. And then you travel to Kuruma, Nkunu, Nkumbu, and all of a sudden you're at a dearth of critical skills. So the real problem, I think, with how you redress the capitalization, allocation, and efficiency drive within the public sector, particularly as it relates to human capital, is an allocation issue, not a capital issue.
Yeah.
If you get the right skills at the right places on the coalface where the delivery happens, then you'll get a higher level of service delivery to the citizenry, and that should translate to a cascading growth in the GDP too.
Because that's another point, Steve, I'll bring it to you. I mean, one of the great relief of this budget, everyone said, no, he's going to put up VAT again. He's going to increase taxes again. He's got no other way to go. At least he didn't do that. But on the other hand, where else is the money going to come from?
Yeah, so I suppose more than anything, and perhaps the most positive point for me was just demonstrating the political will to do the difficult. I think we all know it needed to be done. But we shouldn't underestimate just the politics taking place behind the scenes. I mean, just yesterday we saw unions come out and say that this would be a declaration of war. Obviously he hasn't backed down and he's followed through, which is what the country's been looking for. And I think it's a change of rhetoric away from just trying to increase revenue. We all know that it's difficult, but politically I don't think many people have the true insight into how difficult that exercise is. It has happened. It's going to be interesting to see how unions respond to this declaration of war. But a great relief that they are trying something a little bit new, something that's much needed. We've seen just civil servant increases salary-wise in real terms over the last 10, 12 years, up 40%, without commensurate increases in productivity. And just from a pure business perspective, that's illogical.
What do you say?
No, I totally agree. And again, like I said, there's quite a lot of canvassing for government to actually get some of these proposals on board. The true test, I mean, we can try and dice and slice this thing. The true test is really going to be whether there's an ability and a will to implement these plans. We have a sinking ship. I agree with Vusi, we have a sinking ship. And again, you have to, it's part of a change management, that you must consult, you must get some input. But as a leader and an elected representative, you must take a decision. We have entrusted you with the responsibility to save South Africa Inc. And I think these are tough decisions that are not popular. And the truth be told, we are delaying the inevitable. Because at some point, this is going to happen.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, you're building the momentum. By the time you have to make the decision, the impact is huge.
Absolutely.
It's huge. So I understand where the ministry stands. I understand all these dynamics, but tough calls have to be made. We are in a very dire situation in this country, and government needs to take stern leadership.
Yeah.
Well, we had the president in this very studio a couple of months ago, and I went around before the interview and I canvassed business people, and they said they would sooner see him go down fighting and to the last to try and do something than just sort of hang out there and keep the ship steady. I don't know.
I was about to say, to Xolile's point, I am actually very excited about where we find ourselves as a country for a very simple reason, because we're at a point where platitudes don't work anymore. So you can say the things you want to say to speech, but there are very real economic indicators and people's daily lived realities. Retail shedding jobs, construction shedding jobs, farmer shedding jobs, almost most of the commodity-driven environments shedding jobs. Anglo now out of the country. These are very real realities that we can't walk away from. The exciting thing for me, Chris, is this, is that it forces the governing party at last to make a decision about what is the ideology it's going to use as far as it relates to how do you drive the economy. So it can have the political pressure that comes from the red overalls, but at the end of the day, it's got to operate in a global context where capital has alternatives. And I keep making this point, and I've made this point even to the minister. Capital and return have a supremely monogamous relationship. Capital will never cheat on return. So you can have your own conversations internal about how do you rebase, rebalance, etc. But at the end of the day, global capital is going to flow where the return is committed. We have just lost our number one position as the capital provider to the continent, to Morocco. RMB published the study the other day. Mauritius has made itself a great and fantastic alternative as it relates to alternative asset classes. These are the realities we're facing. Finally, the governing party has to make a decision about what kind of economic policy and ideology do we hold.
And in reality, we're talking about here with capital, you were saying before, that pool of capital here in South Africa is getting smaller and smaller by the year. A lot of the companies who are investing here have been pulling out.
Yeah, look, I don't want to bore your viewers with stats, but it's quite scary when one analyses just the tax base. We've got about 6,600 people that currently earn over 5 million rand and contribute to the fiscus, which is an exceptionally small number, and about 2% of the current population generating about 70% of personal income revenue, which is, I'm sure an alarming low stat, regardless of where in the world you look, emerging markets included.
Anyway, but we all mentioned electricity as well, how important it is to all of your businesses. And there was a little bit of movement on that today, but let's just see what the Finance Minister had to say about Eskom.
Long-term tool, government will, in quotes, do whatever it takes, unquote, to ensure a stable electricity supply. As I said, it is our number one task. We have allocated 230 billion rand over the next 10 years to achieve the restructuring of the electricity sector. The current electricity shortfall will ease as Eskom completes critical maintenance work that they're doing. Bid window 4 of the renewable energy program is being accelerated. The rapid decline in renewable energy prices will give a new impetus momentum to bid window 5.
Now, the thing I want to ask you gentlemen as CEOs and investors, I mean, he says, oh, renewable energy, it'll be fine, we'll invest it. And you look at the palaver that the people in window 3 went through to either get their money, B, get it through the system. It took years. And at the end, the government wanted to haggle them down on price. I mean, it trips easily off the tongue like we do everything we can to make it happen. But I don't know, what do you think?
No, and again, it's a portion of the clip that he didn't play, but there is a statement where he makes about allowing municipalities to buy from IPPs.
Yeah.
I worry about that.
Well, in this very studio, we were talking about the other week, people were saying, well, the municipalities don't have money.
No, exactly. and for me, I mean, how many municipalities are quite stable currently? Yeah. And therefore, those that are not, and you're going to burden them with buying electricity from IPPs, can you imagine what the levies are going to be and So that one was for me a concern when I listened. But I must say, we all know for us to grow this economy, we'll need to have stability in electricity supply. And it's not going to be easy in terms of making sure that you strike a balance between renewable energies and also the fact that we have coal in this country and need to be used in order for us to be relatively competitive. If you look at some of the research houses that are there in terms of making sure that we generate or use or create cleaner coal, which will then deal with the issue that the environmentalists have concerned about. But nonetheless, I think the issue of stability of electricity supply is critical, and government has to do anything and everything. 18 months is just too long. The 18 months has been given, it's just too long. We have to find ways to...
And again, even, I mean, I've done a lot of stories. I don't know whether you've come across investments in that sector, but these guys, I mean, it's not easy to set up a solar plant. You have to get the right skills, the right people, the land, the permission. It takes forever.
We've gone all the way through DD, and then the deal fails at IC. The real issue, I think, with a lot of these IPPs is the liquidity challenge, because in effect, what you're doing is you're privatizing what is a public good, and now you can do that on the presumption that the capital as well as the return private capital makes up for that, right? And education is a great example. So if you look at the growth of Curio, for instance, kind of makes the point that you can build a good public good organization that makes capital. The issue here, to your point, is these municipalities will not have the liquidity to finance these burdens. And so what you're going to end up with is you're going to end up with sequestrations and liquidations on the business side. You're going to end up with a drying up of capital and then the inability to provide electricity too.
Well, speaking about capital, I've got one last short clip. And I want to come to you, Stephen, afterwards. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, I mean, it's one of the big ideas of this budget. It's been put forward. Let's just see what the Finance Minister had to say about it.
A sovereign wealth fund is an important long-term tool for saving and investment for future generations. It can also contribute to strengthening the fiscal framework. We must learn to save during the good times. And the sovereign wealth fund can play an important role as a counter-cyclical fiscal tool. Today, we announced the formation of the South African Sovereign Wealth Fund with a capital injection of 30 billion rand, which easily converts to about $2 billion US.
They are $2 billion US. Sounds like a great idea. He said we can't just spend the money when we're doing well. What do you think, Stephen? Closing comments.
I suppose, does it really sound like a great idea? It feels a little bit out of kilt with what's actually required from the country. I agree with the benefits, but in a country that's staring down the barrel of a 71% debt burden in 2 years' time, is this really the best place to focus our energies at present?
I agree. I think the idea is good, but the timing of it is a bit a challenge.
But isn't it trying to deflect a bit from some of the woes of the economy to say we've got these great ideas?
I'm a bit upset with you because you took my words. Great idea, wrong timing. But I think, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to see it for what it is, right? Which is this for me is not an economic policy. It's a political economics policy. You're under pressure because in Parliament there is a particular set of noise being made. This idea has now gained traction with the average South African who doesn't really know what it means. And so you have to be seen to do something. And I think that's what this is. And you see it too with the allocation. I mean, 30 billion rand is, I imagine, tea and coffee budget at the PIC.
Exactly.
So if he wanted to do something meaningful, he would. I think he's just done it so that it quietens that noise. But to your point, and I completely agree with you, there are bread and butter issues we have to take care of. And I get the sense that he's aware of that too.
Oh, well, let's hope in the next year, before the next budget, he's going to be aware of a lot more things. But thank you very much indeed to my esteemed panel of CEOs. That was Vusi Thembekwayo, the CEO of My Growth Fund, Stephen Schultz, the CEO of Momentum Securities, Xolile Sizani, Group CEO of Servest, unpacking exactly what the CEO's views are on the budget speech.